The Koran and the Bible are not the same, but they do share a lot of similarities, both being holy religious texts within Abrahamic religious traditions. And they share a lot of the same ideas and similar stories and traditions. In fact, the Quran makes several references to previous revelations found in the Bible and mentions the biblical revelations, even if these are considered to have been corrupted. But many of the stories in the Quran are shorter and sometimes different in the Quran than they are in the corresponding biblical texts, such as the story of Adam and Eve and their sons Cain and Abel, the first murderer and the first murder victim, respectively, with the biblical texts and descriptions being far longer, and also Cain being far more sinister in the biblical tradition than in the Quranic tradition, where Cain is more regretful and he also buries Abel after having received instructions from a raven that God sent to instruct him to do as such. And there are other differences too in other stories shared between the Quran and the Bible. Yet differences in stories are not the only differences between the Quran and the Bible. For example, the Quran is considered the literal word of God, the direct word of God, given to the angel Gabriel, who in turn gave the divine word to Muhammad. The Bible has parts that are considered direct revelation, the direct commands from God, such as the 10 Commandments. But most of the Bible is mostly considered human written, but still divinely inspired texts. And this difference gives a whole different level of sacredness to the texts, and thus also creates differences in the criticism of these texts and how a believer stands in relation to these texts. A good way of explaining this sacredness that exists with regards to the Quran is that in Christianity, Jesus is the Word of God. He is the Logos of God. Thus, Jesus' direct statements are the direct statements of God. Whereas in Islam, the Quran is the literal Word of God. Furthermore, the Quran is an oral text. It began as a recitation, something that got remembered and was recited by memorization and word of mouth. And the Quran is often structured in rhythmic and often rhyming prose that can't really be translated into another language. And because of this, the Quran is only recited in Arabic, whereas Christian traditions usually read the Bible in any sort of language, though the traditions of Judaism still read and recite the Torah in Hebrew, so it's similar in that way. And this goes also into the fact that the Bible has some texts that are also originally oral texts, but also has some texts that are direct textual texts that never were oral textual traditions. And both of these oral and textual traditions can differ a lot from each other, because the Bible is not one text, but several texts put together into one textual collection, often where every text is translated into one and the same language, since many of these various texts were written in different languages, mainly Hebrew, Aramaic and Greek, as these texts were from different eras and different places as well, and more or less only shared the commonality of being part of a greater Abrahamic tradition, and that were later decided upon to be included in a text collection. In comparison, the Quran is one singular text, though with different chapters and different subject matters discussed therein. It is not like the Bible, that is the Torah plus the rest of the Tanakh, which are sacred texts made by various Jewish prophets, plus for the Christian traditions, the various New Testament texts, which are also made by various authors. at different points in time, in different places, and not one singular divine revelation stemming from one prophet. Furthermore, different church traditions and different traditions of Judaism have different versions of the Bible, where different types of texts are included in the text collection that is the Bible. And this is due to very different types of canonization processes between Islam, Christianity and Judaism, with the canonization of the Koran happening within one unified political entity and within a shorter time frame, regardless of when you date the date for the canonization of the Quran. In comparison, the Bible canonization processes happened in several different locations and with different processes within different political entities, ranging from Rome to the Aksumite Empire to Armenia, and outside of those entities too, with the Church of the East, for example. And the canonization processes within Judaism, within various branches of Judaism, also happened in several different locations, resulting in different versions of the Tanakh. Furthermore, in comparison to both Judaism and Christianity, the Quran, since it was revealed, was canonized far earlier relative to the date of the supposed revelation than the biblical texts were, as a completely canonized text, even with later dates for the Quran than the time of Uthman. It was still a much earlier date from the revelation than the Christian and Jewish Bibles were canonized, in comparison to the times when their texts were first revealed, or said to first appear, generally, as again, within both Judaism and Christianity and their versions of the Bible, we are not speaking about one text, but several texts, and a long process of canonization, where some texts get included into various branches of Judaism and Christianity over time, over several centuries, and close to a millennia in the longest cases. It's a very slow and long process of canonization, of standardization about which texts to include. Also, unlike the Quran, certain parts of the Bible, certain texts, have been removed from the Bible in various branches of Christianity and Judaism over time. And you also have certain traditions within Christianity and Judaism that still have not finalized their canon of what texts are included in the Bible or not. For example, the Ethiopic Orthodox Tawahedo Church still has their canon open for including texts that not everyone in the church might agree are part of the Bible, but that some members of the church might think are part of the Bible and others might reject. In comparison, the standard Quran of today is finalized. And the only difference you can find between Qurans might be in the recitations, in the qira'at, which are slight different recitations of the Quran, which do include minor differences in meaning. But these cases are very minor and only become significant in very niched questions about interpretation, in certain very narrow matters of interpretation. Another difference between the Quran and the Bible is that in many Christian traditions, but not all Christian traditions, and the case for this is the strongest in Protestant belief traditions about the Bible stands alone as the lone sacred text for the believer. The Quran in Islam does not do that in the same way, as you not only have the Quran, but you also have the Sirah, the prophetic biography, and the Hadiths, the stories about Muhammad and his closest companions, being other sacred texts that you have in addition to the Quran. It's a bigger body of text than just the Quran in Islam. And it is similar to the Jewish traditions, where you for example have the various Talmud traditions and other sacred texts, in addition to the biblical texts, as something that they use to create religious rulings and to formulate their theological outlook on life and their religion. Though in both Judaism and in Islam you do have exceptions. You do have Quran-only Muslims within Islam. And in Judaism you have the Karaites, which is a group that only uses the Tanakh and rejects the Talmud traditions. And in Christianity, you do have certain groups that have secondary literature outside of the Bible, as there are similar traditions within, for example, the Ethiopic Tawahedo Church, about having secondary texts to the Bible that are still sacred texts and are used as part of the religion. But generally, within Christianity, the Bible stands more alone in many cases than the Koran does in Islam. And this was some of the differences between the Koran and the various biblical traditions that exist. And I hope you liked this video, and I hope to see your comments and questions in the comment section, where I will try to respond to you as quickly as possible. Please do subscribe, as it would help the channel spread awareness about the humanities. اشتركوا بالقناة من فضلكم.